get started with some prayer. God, we thank you for this day, and just as we continue to work our way through the book of Genesis and just learning more about your character and just how you were working behind the scenes to set up these foundational people that will just be able to take some life lessons and also some fundamental truths from their lives and learn them and be able to apply them to our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, well, you'll notice every week our pages keep getting smaller and smaller because once we got to kind of the narrative story thing, you know, one point will be a whole story, so it kind of becomes a little bit of a challenge. So where we're picking up from last week is right with the birth of Isaac. Remember last week we ended with Sodom and Gomorrah, and so Abraham's been waiting for basically about 25 years at this point for a kid. God told him when he was 75, hey, you're going to have a son, and he's just constantly waiting. All right, God, when's this going to happen? I'm getting older, I'm getting older, I'm getting older. Now, he's going to live to be about 140, I think it is. So, 100, and he still had about 40 years left. So, he was still a pretty young man in those days. But he's waiting, and finally, you get to chapter 21, and Isaac's born. And then in chapter 22, you have this weird story because Isaac's born, and then almost immediately after, now there's about maybe a 10 or 15 year age gap in time because Isaac's not a little baby in the next story, so it's obvious that he's grown. There's some gaps, so he's probably maybe a teenager at this point, or like 12 years old, somewhere around there. And God comes to Abraham in chapter 22 and says, hey, I want you to go up and make a sacrifice of Isaac. And Abraham is probably at this point thinking, what in the world's going on? I've been waiting 25 years now to get this kid, now you want me to sacrifice him. And so this is I'll just tell you, this is a tough story because this is one of those stories that the atheists love to grab onto and be like, oh, look how mean your God is. He told someone to go and sacrifice their son and this kind of stuff. Richard Dawkins, who's an atheist, he's a biologist by trade, but he writes all these like anti-Christian books, and he's on the New York Times bestseller and this kind of stuff. He just wrote a new book, and one of the chapters is on how evil God is because he told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac and that kind of thing. Obviously, he didn't read the end of the story, or he would have figured out that God didn't really do that. But so how it works is Abraham goes up. Actually, I'm kind of jumping ahead here. I don't know why I made this slide and then do that. So Isaac's born. I kind of jumped ahead. His name means laughter, if you translate it into Hebrew. So it's kind of like Abraham and Sarah kept laughing at God, so God said, you think that's funny? Just name your kid Laughter so that you have to remind yourself every time. It'd be like if your room was always dirty, you name the kid Clean or something like that. Does a kind of a practical joke by God. So Abraham's 100, Sarah's 90, Ishmael was 14 by the time Isaac's born. So he's not a little kid. He's a teenager at this point, and that's going to be a play a part because you get this story where Isaac's about 3 years old, probably roughly, and Ishmael is making fun of him, like good big brothers always do. Kind of, hey, you're a little baby, you're still weaning off your mother, and Sarah gets upset. She's like, hey, that's my son. You're the handmaiden's son. You shouldn't be calling out my son. So she tells Abraham, I want you to get rid of this lady and her kid. I'm done with them. Get rid of them. So Abraham, in perhaps a poor state of mind, lets her go, and she runs off into the desert and is about to die. And an angel comes and provides for her while in her son. That's the second time that's happened because she also had something similar that happened when she was pregnant with Ishmael. So if God wanted to solve the Middle East crisis, 2,000 years before it ever started, he could have just let Ishmael die because he ends up being the father of the Arabs. But God is showing, no, I've got a plan that's going through this. So then you get to chapter 22. And in the story, we can kind of look back on things. And if you were just reading Genesis, you probably wouldn't see this just from Genesis. But because we can look back, you see that Isaac becomes a kind of a type of Christ. The idea that he is, some of his characteristics are then portrayed in Christ in the New Testament. We'll see that with Isaac, with Joseph, with several characters as we kind of go through the story. Sometimes some translations call it a temptation from God. That sounds kind of like God's doing something wrong. The word can mean temptation or test. It's kind of, I like to go with more of a test. It's like God is kind of testing his faith. Is he really going to do what I've asked him to do? I've finally given him this blessing. What is he going to do with this? So he takes him, he goes, I want you to go up on Mount Moriah and make this sacrifice. Mount Moriah, as we'll see here, is where the Dome of the Rock is today in Jerusalem. It's also where the temple would later be built. So this is kind of a weird thing. This mountain is the temple's built there. Abraham has a sacrifice there. Muhammad claims that's where he went up to see God, and Islam. And part of Mount Moriah is actually laid farther down is Golgotha, where Jesus is crucified. So this mountain. I think it'd be like you're on one side of the Peaks of Otter, you're on the other side is the other part of Golgotha. So it's this mountain that keeps kind of showing up in the story, so to speak, as you go through. So this is what it looks like inside the Dome of the Rock now. People always ask, what's inside the Dome of the Rock? It's called the Dome of the Rock, just a big rock. That's all that's in there. The Muhammad claims that the rock floated and carried him off to heaven. So in Islam, so that's what's there now. But God has to make this sacrifice. But you see Abraham's kind of faith throughout this whole kind of story, if you will. First, they get there. He's got him and Isaac and two servants, and they stop at the foot of the mountain, and he goes, you guys stay here, he's talking to the servants, and we'll come back and see you. He knows God's already told him you're going to sacrifice Isaac. So it shows already he has faith that he says, we will come back and see you. He knows, I don't know, we don't exactly know what it was going through his mind. The book of Hebrews kind of gives us some insight. Hebrews chapter 11. The author of Hebrews says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. Through Isaac, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. So Abraham, according to the book of Hebrews, figured, hey, if I kill Isaac, God's going to bring him back to life somehow. He's going to raise him from the dead. So he had some pretty strong faith as he's going through this whole story. Now, Isaac also has to have some faith because think, if Abraham is 115 at this point, he's probably not in the greatest shape. So if Isaac's a teenager or 12 years old, if dad starts, trying to make a sacrifice, he may not be able to beat his dad up, but he probably can outrace him in a foot race if he has to. So he could have ran away or done something. So he has to have some kind of faith in God and his father as he goes through this as well. And then right at the end, he's just about to sacrifice him, and God stops him, says, no, I'm not going to make you sacrifice your son. There's a ram caught in the thicket, and he kills the ram, and they have the sacrifice that way. And you kind of get this typology because God says, oh no, I'm not going to make you kill your son. But then later, through the pages of the Bible, we get to the New Testament, and God says, I'm not going to make you kill your son. Instead, I will sacrifice my own son on almost this very same place to take care of the sin problem. So you kind of a connection that you get through the Old Testament. Now, they wouldn't have known that at the time, but God kind of reveals it as you go through. Something we'll see very often in the Old Testament, this idea of the Christophany. Sometimes it's kind of a picture of, it's when Jesus shows up in the Old Testament. Sometimes it's called the angel of the Lord. It's basically, from what we can tell, Jesus in the Old Testament before he comes down to the cross, or to the, not the cross, to the virgin birth and all of that. We know that because God is a spirit. John tells us in the book of John that no one has seen God the Father. So if you keep seeing God show up in the Old Testament, and Abraham talks to God, Moses sees God, all this kind of stuff, it's probably more of a Christophany, them seeing Jesus before in his pre-incarnate form, whatever that would look like. Sometimes it makes it look like he looks like a man. It says that there's 3 men that walked up to Abraham in chapter 17, and so did he look like a man? Did he look the same in the Old Testament as he did when he grew up as a baby? We don't know. We don't have any pictures of him. It'd be nice. Usually every picture of Jesus looks exactly like what the artist kind of looked like. So, you know, it'd be like, oh yeah, Jesus had long hair. Why? Because I have long hair, and it makes it look right, and this kind of stuff. So, but then, as the story continues, Abraham starts getting old. And Abraham, we'll see in the story, as we go through Genesis, people, remember, they don't have hospitals. They don't really have doctors necessarily at this point. So they get old, they start thinking they're going to die. And sometimes when they start thinking this, they're going to live for a long time. Jacob thinks he's going to die at one point, we'll see. Not Jacob, Isaac thinks he's going to die. We'll see it later today. And he lives for like 20 more years. So they kind of were a little hypochondriacs in the Old Testament. They're always thinking they're on the verge of death and they'll live for a long time. But Abraham's thinking, all right, I don't have much time left. And Isaac needs a wife. He needs to be able to carry on this line. So Abraham brings over his servant and says, you need to go find a wife for Isaac. But I don't want you to marry any of the Canaanite people. We'll see why that becomes a problem here in a couple of chapters. The Canaanites were ungodly. They had all kinds of moral problems. So he's like, I don't want you to marry people from around here. So I want you to go back up to Haran, which is where the rest of Abraham's family had settled. And I want you to go find him a wife from kind of my clan, so to speak. We don't really have clans anymore in our culture. But it's kind of go find my relatives and meet and go with them. So he tells the servant, why don't you go find him? And the servant goes, well, what happens if I can't find him, or the person doesn't want to get married, or any of these things? And he goes, well, I don't care. As long as you do your job, if they don't do it, that'll be fine, but I want you to go do this. So he sends this servant up, and this servant goes all the way up to Haran, which is all the way up in Syria today. And once we get to a map, I don't know if I have a map in here. I should have put a map. No. But it's up in basically where Syria it would be today. And he goes to this well, and he's kind of praying. Now, he's praying to Abraham's God. So Abraham obviously is teaching people that work for him or that are under him about his God, and he has a relationship with God as well. And so he gets there and he goes, well, how in the world am I going to do this? He didn't tell me where to go, what to do, how am I supposed to do this? So he's praying, he prays to God, and he kind of says, God, I want some girl to come up to this well and give me water and water my camels, and that's the girl that you're going to pick out for Isaac. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this if you're looking for a wife today. Probably not the best option. You know, they didn't have a Bible at this point. The Bible had not been written. He's going based off of some very limited information on what they had. So we always tell our students in Bible 105, you know, don't ask God, okay, let me go to the cafeteria and whoever sits next to me on the first day of school, that's the one I'm going to marry, kind of thing. Probably not going to work out for you. But so he is going, and all of a sudden, Rebecca walks up. She's carrying this big jar on her, probably either on her shoulder or on her head, depending on how big it was. That's usually how they carried them back then. And she gives them some water. Now, in the ancient world, if somebody asked for water, and they live in the desert pretty much at this point, you have to give them water. It's just kind of a custom. It'd be like somebody walks up and asks you what time it is. Generally speaking, if you're a nice person and you have a watch, you're just not going to go, well, time for you to get a watch. You know, you just look at your thing and say, oh, it's 6:15 or whatever. But you don't have to give them your watch or something like that. She kind of goes beyond the extra mile. She says, I'll water you and I'll water your camels. Now, I don't know anything about camels. Never had a camel. I did ride a camel once at Cincinnati Zoo when I was a very little kid. But from what I understand, camels drink a lot of water because they store it, and that's why they were great in the desert. So she's going to be having to fill up this jug probably like 15, 20 times. He has 10 camels full of gifts that he's going to give to her family as the story goes on. So she feels this must have taken a couple hours maybe for her to drop all this stuff in the well, pull up all this water, and do all this stuff. And he's just kind of sitting there, and she gets done, and he goes, okay, can I get some more information from you? You know, who are you related to? Where is this all? Because he's kind of hoping that he prayed, but he's also kind of hoping, okay, is this going to be from the right family? Is this? She goes, oh, well, my name is Rebecca, and I'm married, or I am the daughter of this person, and I'm from this clan. And he goes, hey, you're exactly the people that I'm looking for. She's the daughter of Abraham's brother, one of his brothers. He had 3 brothers, I believe, or two or three brothers. And so she's related to him in that clan unit kind of thing. And so he goes, I want to go home and meet your family. She doesn't tell her at this time exactly why he's there for. He's wanting to, in the ancient world, you couldn't just ask somebody, will you marry someone? You had to kind of make an arrangement with their family. This still happens in the Middle East some places, but and in parts of Africa. But, you know, if I wanted to marry Natalie, I couldn't just, you know, you usually call, in our culture, you usually call the dad and ask for permission. And I did that. Just want that on the record. I did call and ask Natalie's dad for permission. It was a very nervous conversation. But we do that as kind of a custom. In the ancient world, you had no choice. You had to go and make a deal. You had to say, I'll give you this many cattle and sheep and this kind of stuff for a dowry, and then you will allow me to marry your daughter. And so he walks up and he meets Laban, who becomes a bigger part of the story. We'll see him. Laban is Rebecca's sister, or not Rebecca's sister, Rebecca's brother, and he's greedy. We'll find that out here in a little bit. He's greedy. He just sees all the camels, and he's like, yeah, you can have my sister. I don't even like her anyway. Just leave all your stuff for me. So, and then her dad, and so the servant meets the dad, and they have this long conversation, and finally they agree, and then they go, oh yeah, by the way, we should probably ask Rebecca if she's willing to go and meet this guy, marry this guy that she's never met. That's probably a good thing to ask. So they ask her, and she says, yeah, I'll go. And so they dump all this stuff on the camels to Laban and to the father. And then she comes back and is riding on the camel and meets Isaac for the first time. And then they get married, and everything is pretty much going pretty smooth. This is, Sarah dies. I forgot to mention that too. Sarah dies. See, I get all caught up in these stories and I keep forgetting all the details. Sarah dies in chapter 24. She's 127 years old, so she lives a long time after as well. And she is buried at the cave of Machpelah. Now the Cave of Machpelah, they know where this is. They found it. On top of the Cave of Machpelah today is this giant church. They call it the Church of the Patriarchs. Why? Because they figured out this is where the cave is. And this the Patriarchs. It's a Catholic church, and they want to dig underneath it to see if they can find this cave, because, well, as we'll see, a lot of the patriarchs are buried there. Abraham's buried there, Sarah's buried there, Isaac and Rebekah are buried there, and then Jacob is going to get buried there along with Leah. So there'll be 6, if they could find 6 bodies, it would greatly show, hey, these stories aren't just made up. They found the cave where these people were. The problem is, it's controlled by the Israelis, and the Israelis go, we don't touch dead bodies. It's part of the law that you don't touch a dead body. It's unclean. So they don't like people digging around empty tombs, or empty tombs, I don't care if it's empty. Digging around tombs and these kind of things. So maybe one day they'll actually be able to dig underneath this thing and find these, but that's kind of where this cave is. So in the meantime, he goes up to Haran. This is Israel here. Haran is all the way up here in the north. So it's a pretty long distance where he has to go, where they're from. What's interesting about Haran, and I threw this slide in just for some things. I wrote a paper, and it got published this time last year, it's about a 48-page paper on the historicity of the patriarchs. I'm not going to put all my points up there. I'd bore you to death. You'd be like, I don't care about this. But one of the interesting things is Haran, the city of Haran, was destroyed in about 1800 BC. Why is this important? Because Haran is going to keep showing up in the story. Jacob's going to go back to Haran. A lot of people live in Haran, and it's not rebuilt for 1,000 years. So if they were just making this story up, these weren't real people, real places, stuff, you wouldn't make up a story about a place that's been destroyed for 1,000 years and say, oh yeah, that's where all of our ancestors came from. Nobody knew what Haran was for 1,000 years. If you get destroyed, nobody knows what the city is. So it's highly unlikely that if you're going to pick some place, you would have just been like, oh yeah, that's where our family's from. It's from this ancient city that no one's ever heard of that's been destroyed for 1,000 years. You just said, oh, our family is from Jerusalem or something like that, in their culture. So we get to Jacob. Finally, we're moving through the patriarchs. Isaac and Rebekah get married. They have some problems having kids, which becomes kind of another theme that keeps coming through. Sarah can't have kids. Then Rebekah has some problems having kids. And then we'll see Rachel has some problem having kids. In the ancient world, that was pretty common. You didn't have medical things that we have today that allow to help in these areas. So you just kind of kept trying, and if you couldn't, you had to adopt somebody, or you had to find a servant and have them adopt, like kind of what Abraham was trying to do. And so eventually Isaac prays for her, and they have kids. They have these 2 kids, Jacob and Esau. Now in the story, they're twin brothers, but they're not identical twins. They're almost completely different. Esau comes out first, and so he's the oldest. He's older by like 10 minutes, but I'm sure he probably rubbed it in onto his brother all his life. Hey, I'm the older brother, I'm the big brother, you get to listen to what I say, kind of thing. He's the oldest, but he ends up being this kind of rough, tough hunting guy. It talks about he's this big hairy guy. We'll see he's got hair all over the place. He's got red hair, so it's probably very unique in the ancient world. And he goes out hunting. He's making stew. He's probably a member of the NRA in the ancient world and all this kind of stuff. He's this hunting guy. Jacob comes out, and he's kind of like a chef. He stays with his mom and learns how to cook. And so they're very different. It's like night and day. They're completely different. They're brothers, but they're not anything alike. So Jacob is going to keep kind of trapping his brother, or tricking his brother into these things. And Esau doesn't exactly use his brain a lot of times. He's kind of like a middle linebacker or something. He's just kind of big and tough and dumb all at the same time, or something like that. He keeps getting tricked into these things. So, but first, he has the birthright. Esau does, and he's hungry one day. And he's like, man, I'm so hungry. I've been out in the field. And he comes back, and Jacob's making some stew, some kind of stew or chili or whatever it is in the ancient world, whatever they ate. And he's like, I'm so hungry, I just want to eat. What will it cost me to get some of this stew, Jacob? And he goes, how about you sell me your birthright? That sounds weird to us. You'd be like, oh, why in the world is this? And Esau's like, I'm so hungry, sure, whatever. He sells him his birthright for like a bowl of chili, basically. Now, probably what Esau's thinking is, I'm big and tough. I'm the older brother. I can just tell Jacob whatever I want, and he has to do it anyway, so who cares about the birthright? But he gives up this leadership thing that God had placed in his life, and then he's going to take away the blessing as well. This is a story where he tricks him. So he's getting towards the end of his life. Isaac's getting towards the end. Now he's going to live, like I told you, like another 20, 30 years after this. So Isaac's getting old. He's he's not completely blind, but he's kind of what we would call like legally blind, where he would, if he was alive today, he wouldn't be able to drive, and he could kind of see people, but just kind of shapes. He's not able to see at this point really well. And so he's like, I'm going to die. I have to give up the blessing. Now, in the ancient world, their wills were all oral. They didn't write anything down. It was before you died, you gave your blessing to whoever you wanted in your line, and that was sealed. And once you gave your word, you can't you can't go back on it. This becomes important in several stories. It becomes important in this one. Later on in Joshua, we'll see it becomes important. Even if you're tricked into giving your word on something, in the ancient world, they thought once you said something, you had to stick to it, even if you were tricked into it. So, Rebecca overhears this story. Isaac's favorite son is Esau. Rebecca's favorite son is Jacob. So they're kind of playing favorites with their kids, which already is a problem. And then God had already told them, I forgot to mention this part as well, God had told them when they were born that Jacob was the promised son. He's the one that the promise is going to go through. So Isaac is kind of ignoring God by giving Esau the favored place. But Scripture says that Isaac loved meat, venison, and this kind of stuff, and so Esau was a hunter, so he's like, oh yeah, of course I'm going to love the hunter guy, and so he kind of loves him a little more than Jacob, unfortunately, and Rebecca's teaching Jacob how to cook and all this stuff, so she's got her own favorite. So Rebecca hears this, Isaac's getting old, he calls in Esau and says, I'm about to die, I want you to go and fetch me some venison and cook it for me, and you come back and I'm going to give you the blessing. So Esau leaves and goes out to hunt to bring the blessing. So Rebecca overhears this and then goes to Jacob and said, hey Jacob, Dad's about to give the blessing away. Your dad's about to give the blessing away to Esau. That's not good. Let's trick him into giving the blessing to you. He can't barely see anyway, so this will be easy. And Jacob goes, well, how's this going to work, Mom? Esau's a hairy dude. My dad's going to reach out and feel me, and know that I'm not Esau. So they go and kill a goat and put goat skin on Jacob. Esau must have been like the hairiest guy in the history of the world if they got to put goat skin on. But so they put this on, and then and she's like, oh, I got some venison back in the freezer. I don't know if they had no freezer in the ancient world, but they kind of back in the storage, and she cooks it up like how Esau would have cooked it up. And Jacob goes in to see Isaac and goes, oh, Dad, I'm here. I brought the venison. And Isaac's not dumb. He goes, well, you're telling me you're Esau, but you sound like Jacob. Like your voice is gonna. So I don't know if he like coughed really loud. Oh, I got the flu, Dad. My voice is changed. I don't know how he got away with that necessarily. But he reaches out and touches him, and he feels all the hair, and he goes, "Oh, you got to be Esau because nobody else in the world's this hairy. So you got to be my son." Maybe they thought his hearing was going bad at that point or something. So he gives him the blessing and provides it to him. Well, Esau comes back. Esau's kind of a hothead. He comes back and to his dad and says, "Hey, Dad, I brought the venison." And Isaac's like, "What are you talking about? You were just here like 10 minutes ago." And so he figures out that they do this, and he goes, "I'm going to kill Jacob. I'm going to kill him. Get rid of him. I don't like the kid anyway. He's my younger brother. I'm just going to kill him, get rid of him." Well, Rebecca overhears this and goes, "Oh no, this is not good. My one son's wanting to kill my other son. Probably not a good idea." So she tells Jacob, "Hey, Esau's going to kill you. So why don't you go and visit Laban, your uncle, up in Haran for a couple weeks?" Now she thinks he's going to be gone for like a couple weeks. He's going to be gone for 20 years. She's going to die before he ever comes back. So she's never going to see him again. But she goes, "Go see Uncle Laban, stay with him for a while until Esau cools down." So he takes off running, and he ends up at this place called Bethel, which is where he has the story of the ladder that he has this dream. First of all, he uses a rock as a pillow, so maybe if you used a rock as a pillow, maybe you'd have some weird dreams too. I don't know. I use that. I got one of those free My Pillow things I've been trying. Pretty nice pillow, but better than a rock, I would guess, probably. So he goes and has this dream in chapter 28. Let me just read what God tells him in this dream. It says, "Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and beheld, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it." So he's got this dream of this giant ladder. How big a ladder would go up to heaven, I don't know. It's a dream, so you don't really have to take it literally. But he sees this giant ladder, and angels are going up and down on it. And it says, "And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your grandfather," the term is the same in the ancient world, "and the God of Isaac." Now what's interesting is he doesn't say, "and your God," because Jacob's kind of not spiritual at this point. He's on the run, he's a deceiver, he's always telling lies. We'll see this gets him even into more trouble. So he's not there yet. Now eventually he will turn to God, but he's kind of in his rebellious years, if you will, running away from God. And he said, "The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring." So he's repeating the promise that God gave to Abraham. He repeats it to Isaac. Now he's repeating it to Jacob. He's carrying on this line through the book of Genesis. He says, "Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread around to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed." So it's almost the exact same language used in chapter 12 with Abraham. "Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land." So he tells them, I know you're leaving the land, but you're going to come back. So it's kind of this promise by God. Now, Jacob at this point doesn't realize it's going to be 20 years. He's probably thinking, well, of course I'm going to be back. I'm going to be back in like 2 weeks. I'm going to come home after Esau pulls off. But he didn't realize what's going to happen. So he's going to be gone for a long time. So that says, Jacob woke up from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place?" Now, awesome meaning like in a reverential thing, not like awesome like it's cool, like sometimes we use the word today. "This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." So it says early in the morning he took a stone and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of the place Bethel, which means the house of God. So Bethel becomes kind of the place where he's going to keep meeting God through the story. And we'll see that as it goes through. Well, eventually he makes his way up to Haran. And he goes to the same well that the servant had went to maybe 40 years later at this point. They don't rebuild wells in the ancient world unless you have to, because the water, it's tapped into the water, and they have that. And so he gets to the well, and there's a giant rock on top of it, because they put a rock on it to keep the flies out and all the nasty bugs and stuff out. And all these girls are coming up to the well to get the water. Now, if Esau would have been there, he would probably been like, oh yeah, I can take care of this rock, throw it off to the side, and gotten all the girls. But Esau's gone, so Jacob's kind of like, oh, I'll move the rock, and he kind of pushes the rocks over, barely gets it off. It kind of impresses some of the ladies, and Rachel shows up, and it's like love at first sight. They see each other, and it's like, hey, you look different than everybody else. And she's like, yeah, you're big and strong and push the rock over. He's probably like, good thing you didn't meet my brother. He's big and strong too. But they fall in love almost at first sight. And so they meet, and he goes, I'm looking for this guy named Laban. Have you seen him? She's like, oh, it's my dad. So he takes him back to Laban. They meet, and Laban's like, you can tell in the story, he's like, the best way to describe Laban is kind of like a crooked used car salesman in the ancient world. He's always lying and cheating everyone out of their money and this kind of stuff. And so Jacob does up and says, hey, Uncle Laban, I'm here, and I really like your daughter. I'd like to marry her. And Laban's like, okay, where's all those camels that remember when your dad needed a wife, he brought me a bunch of stuff. And he's like, well, I had to run off from home. I left the checkbook. I didn't bring any camels. I don't have any money. So I can't really pay for the dowry. So he goes, well, how about I make you a deal? You work for me for 7 years, and I will let you marry my daughter. And Jacob, being in love, and just says, oh, sure, yeah, no big deal. Work 7 years and just to marry this girl. And the Bible says that, and the time went by so fast because he was in love. So he's kind of like head over heels in love, doesn't really, it just blows by. And so then finally comes 7 years and he goes to get married. And in the ancient world, still like the Middle East today sometimes, you get married, they're covered, the girls are covered up pretty well. You can't really see who you're actually marrying half the time because they got the veils on and the headdress and all this kind of stuff. And so he gets married, and he wakes up the next day, and it's her sister, Leah, is laying next to him. And he's like, wait a second, what happened here? I didn't marry you. What's going on? So he goes to his father-in-law and says, hey, Laban, what's going on here, buddy? I thought I was marrying Rachel. And Laban sells him this story of, oh, well, in our culture, we always marry the oldest daughter first, and then we marry the youngest daughter. And he's like, well, I wish you'd have kind of told me that before I got married. Before I worked 7 years and did all this stuff. So he goes, okay, well, I want to marry your other daughter too. Now, what's sad in the story is there's no sense of spiritual nature in Jacob. He doesn't pray. He doesn't ask God, hey, God, what should I do throughout almost this entire event. Now, Leah is the woman that he was supposed to be with. We know this because he's going to have Judah, who is the line of Christ, goes through Judah with Leah. He's going to ultimately be buried with Leah. She's the one that he was kind of supposed to be with, but he gets tricked into marrying her. So instead of praying and asking God, hey, well, maybe this is what you wanted, he just goes, all right, well, I just want to marry both of them now. How long do I have to work to marry Rachel? He's like, well, you paid 7 years for Leah. It's only fair you work 7 more years for Rachel. And he's like, okay, but I get to marry Rachel now. Like, I'm not working 7 more years to do this. So he goes, all right, well, have a week with Leah, kind of go off on a little honeymoon. I don't know what they did in the ancient world for a honeymoon, go down to the well and something. But spend a week with her, and then you can marry Rachel too. But you got to work for me for 7 more years. So he ends up working for 14 years for these 2 wives. And then he works 6 more years to kind of actually get some spending money, to get some kind of a little nest egg for himself in this. So he's gone for 20 years. It's a long time. And then in the story, each of the girls, Leah and Rachel, have like handmaidens, kind of like a servant, or so eventually they start having kids, and they get into this giant childbearing contest. Leah starts having kids. She pops out a bunch of kids. She has Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah first. And so she has 4 kids right off the bat. She's like, and so Rachel starts getting frustrated. She's like, I want to have kids. She's having some health problems or something. God has kind of closed her womb at this point. And so she's what in the world's going on? So she comes up with this plan. Okay, if I can't have kids, then I'll give you my handmaiden, and you can sleep with her and have kids. Now to us, this goes, what kind of wife would give another woman to your husband? But remember, ancient world, she's already. It's kind of like, what is it? There's that TV show like Sister Wives kind of thing. It's kind of a bad situation that's going on here. And anyway, so she gives her handmaiden Bilhah to Jacob, and Jacob's kind of a little bit of a sleazeball, I guess, in the story. He just goes, sure, I'll sleep with whoever. He's kind of doing this. So she ends up having Dan and Naphtali. Then Leah goes, well, if you could give your handmaiden to him, then I'm going to give my handmaiden to you. And so she gives him Zilpah. And Zilpah has Gad and Asher. And then Leah gets pregnant again and has Issachar and Zebulun. So they got 10 kids. And finally Rachel gets pregnant. And she has Joseph. And then she has Benjamin. And while she's pregnant with Benjamin, she dies in childbirth. Very common in the ancient world that childbirth was a tough thing, that you would die. It happened even 100 years ago. It was very hard. So she dies. So these are the only 2 with Rachel. So these become kind of Isaac's favorite kid, or Jacob's favorite kids. Now, if anyone should have known, don't play favorites with their kids, it should have been Jacob, because his parents had done the same thing with him, but they always say, what you end up like your parents sometimes, he ends up doing the very same thing. So eventually, they're going to end up being the 12 tribes of Israel. And we'll get to that as we go through. But eventually, they have all these kids. At this point in the story, Benjamin is not born yet. We kind of jumped ahead with showing the 12 kids. But Benjamin's not born yet. Joseph's a little kid. And it's been 20 years, so Jacob finally goes, all right, I want to go home. I want to go back to Canaan. God promised me that. He promised that he would go. I want to go back to Canaan. I'm going to take you guys with me. My father-in-law is a cheapskate anyway. He's changed his wages. It says he changed his wages 10 different times. He's always changed. He's kind of like a ancient world money launderer or something. He's always changing his wages. He's like, I got to get away from this Jacob guy, or this Laban guy. He's my father-in-law, but he's not the greatest. So he finally says, we're going to sneak away. Laban goes on a trip, and he's like, we're going to sneak away while Laban's gone. And the daughters are just like, sure, we're going to do that, because I don't know if they really like their dad either, because he keeps, selling them off and all this kind of stuff. So they sneak off to go back to Canaan, and Laban comes home and finds out about it and catches up to them and meets them, because they got a bunch of kids. It takes a long time. When you got little kids, they always have to go to the bathroom. They always have to ask where it's going. So Laban's able to catch them pretty fast. And he says, where are you going? And he's like, oh, we're leaving. We're going back to where I'm from, back to Canaan. Now Jacob does not know that Rachel has stolen the little household idol gods that her dad had to take back with him. That's going to become a big issue in the story, as we'll see here in a second. idolatry starts becoming more prominent even in their own family. And you got this weird story. She's pregnant and she's going through all these health issues. And so Laban goes, I think one of you guys stole my little idol statues. I'm going to find out who it is. He checks everybody. She's sitting up on her camel with the idols underneath her. And he's like, oh, I need to check you. And she's like, oh, Dad, I'm not feeling well. I'm pregnant. And he goes, okay. So she kind of lies to him and hides these things. But eventually Jacob goes, all right, enough's enough. We're going to draw kind of a line in the sand here. And they use this term, Mizpah, in Hebrew. It means kind of a boundary line. Now, was there a line, a rock, something? And it basically is, you stay over on your side, I'm going to go on my side. If you cross this line, God's going to strike you dead. So they end on pretty bad terms. This is not the greatest family dynamic that's going on here. So eventually they make it back. Now, Jacob has a problem. He gets back and he goes, I wonder if my brother still hates me and wants to kill me. It's been a long time, but it kind of left on bad terms. But he's like, it's been a long time. But then he meets this guy on the road, and he hears, oh yeah, your brother Esau's coming to meet you. And he brought 400 men with him. And he's like, well, this ain't good. This is bad. He wants to kill me still. It's been 20 years, he's still trying to kill me. So Jacob, being the man that he is, goes, I got a good idea. I'm going to send the handmaidens first with all their kids. I'm going to send Leah first with all her kids. I'm going to send Rachel with all her kids. And I'm going to stay at the end. It's kind of like softening him up, and so hopefully he won't kill me at the end. And so he's kind of a coward at this point still. And so then at night, he's sleeping by himself. All his family's already kind of went ahead of him. And he has this wrestling match with this divine being. The story is, it's kind of a weird story. He's wrestling with this figure. Probably Christ, because he changes his name. He does all this kind of stuff that only God really could do. And so he wrestles with him, and he finally changes his name to Israel, which is, so he's going to, sometimes when he's doing something bad in the story, he's called Jacob. And when he's doing something good in the story, they kind of use his name Israel, so it kind of goes back and forth. But this is where you get the idea of Israel. It's Jacob's new name. They change it, God changes it to Israel in this story. So he finally meets Esau, and Esau's like, hey, Jacob, guess what? Dad's still alive. And he's probably like, I thought Dad was supposed to be dying like 20 years ago. And he's like, no, Dad's still alive. Mom's dead. And so when he says Mom's dead, he's like, uh-oh, I don't want to be around you. She was kind of my protector. She was the one that keeping you away from killing me. So he lies to him again. He says, Esau has moved down to Edom. It's named after him. Down in Petra, we'll see they become one of the main enemies of Israel, his people. And he says, why don't you move down with me? And Jacob goes, oh yeah, we'll be down. We got the kids. It takes a little long. We'll be right down. Tell your wives that we'll be right down. He's got a couple wives himself. And as soon as Esau leaves, he's like, we ain't going down there. I ain't living with that guy. And he immediately starts going back to the north and ends up outside this town called Shechem. Shechem is kind of like a new version of Sodom and Gomorrah that has been established. It's not a great town, filled with a bunch of sin and idolatry and all kinds of stuff. So they're going through the town. He has a daughter named Dinah. We don't know how many daughters Jacob had. He has 12 sons, but he has a daughter named Dinah, at least one daughter named Dinah. She's in the town one day, and she gets raped by a guy named Shechem. Now, it gets confusing because the town's named Shechem, the guy's named Shechem. It'd be like if you moved to Montana and you met a guy named Montana or something like that, or Dakota and you met a guy named Dakota. Either he was, the town was named after his family, or he was named after the town, one of the two. But he rapes the daughter, and so it's a bad story. So Jacob's all upset, obviously, his daughter's been raped. and he starts talking to Shechem's father. And Shechem's father goes, well, you know, it was just a mistake. He really loves your daughter. He didn't really mean it. Why don't we make an alliance? Why don't they get married? And you got a bunch of sons. I've got a bunch of daughters in my city. We can get married and create this alliance. And Jacob kind of goes, oh, let me think about it. And Levi and Simeon kind of come up with this plan. They jump ahead and they go, that sounds like a great idea. But see, we are Jewish people, and we have to go through circumcision. We're not allowed to marry anybody that doesn't go through circumcision. So he goes, okay, well, we'll have all of our guys get circumcised this week. So they have all their guys get circumcised. So all the guys are kind of laying up in the hospital, so to speak, through this. And then they go through the town and kill all the men, Levi and Simeon, and probably some of the servants. Probably not them by themselves, but probably some of the servants, because they're all laid up. They kill all the men. They burn the town. They create all this thing, and Jacob's horrified. He's like, well, this isn't good. Everyone's going to hate us. Everyone's going to try and kill us. Why in the world did you guys do this? This was not a good idea. And so eventually they move. God protects them through some divine things. And they move back. Here's where Shechem is. They move back to Bethel, which is where I think God probably thought they were going to move back anyway. That's where the ladder was, where he had met God. And Jacob kind of finally has his kind of come to Jesus moment after this. But he's an old guy. He's kind of like probably in his 50s or 60s at this point. He gets saved. He gets converted and starts changing his life. So he kind of goes overboard. What happens a lot of times when people get saved later in life is they're like, oh, I was this terrible person, so I'm going to go to the other extreme. So he goes to his kids and he's like, all right, we got to get rid of all this pagan stuff. So he collects all their idols, all their jewelry that's kind of pagan related, all this stuff, and he buries it in the yard under this tree and before they move back to Bethel. It's kind of like Dad gets saved and goes into the room and takes all the rock music and goes and throws it out in the trash or something like that and burns it. He's like, let's get rid of this. Now Joseph is still fairly young at this point. So Joseph is going to grow up with kind of a spiritual dad. But a lot of the older kids, they're already, 15, 18 years old. They've grown up with a dad who was kind of a pagan and didn't really care and had all these problems. So they're going to have some of the same issues that their own dad has. So when you get, wait a second, went too far. I don't actually have, I think I deleted a slide on accident. So, because I'm supposed to have another slide in between that one. So Joseph, actually I think I put this other slide in the wrong spot. Let me do that and then I'll go back. Yeah, here it is. Then I'll go back. Joseph becomes his father's favorite. Gives him the coat of many colors. Was it some kind of rainbow coat? We don't know what it looks like, but to color anything in the ancient world costs a lot of money, so it's this kind of fancy coat, so to speak. And his brothers hate him. He's the pet, he's dad's favorite, he's the father's pet, they're like, oh, that Joseph guy. And he doesn't, and then he has this dream, and he tells his brothers, oh, I had this dream. They already don't like him. I had this dream where you guys all bowed down and worshiped and bowed down to me and made me in charge. Now think about it. He's the 11th brother in line. He's got 10 older brothers. How do you think that's going to go over when your 11th in line says, oh yeah, you guys are all going to bow down to me? They're like, you're like a little kid. We're never going to bow down to you. You're crazy. Then he has another dream, and even the mom and the dad bow down to him. Now this is eventually will get fulfilled in Egypt. Well, once we get there probably next week. But so they go out, the 10 older brothers are out up by Shechem, they're farming, and they've been away for a long time, so Jacob says, oh, Joseph, I want you to go find your brothers and bring them home. So he goes out, and they see him coming. Why? Because he's got this coat that nobody else has. They can see him probably from miles away. I don't know if it's shined in the sun or how it looked, but they see him from afar, and they're like, oh, there's that dreamer. There's Dad's favorite. Let's get rid of him. So they throw him in this ditch, probably like a old well that ran out of water at this point or something. They throw him in this ditch, and they're like, let's kill him. And Reuben, who's the oldest, goes, no, we can't kill him. That wouldn't be good. He is our brother after all. He's like the one guy that has a little bit of sense. So Reuben goes, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him. That'll be better. It's like, okay, bro, I guess it's better than getting killed, but you're still not my favorite brother now. But so they sell him into slavery. And the Ishmaelites, they sell him to these Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites are like his cousins. So he gets sold into his distant cousins to get taken down to Egypt to get sold. And he's sold for 20 shekels of silver. Now think about it. There's 10 brothers. They get like 2 silver coins to sell their brother. Like, that doesn't seem like that just shows you how much they hated him that they do this. Now another interesting apologetics thing is this is the price we found in the ancient records of what a slave would have cost about this time. And that changes over time. Later on it would become 30, then 40 silver. Jesus is eventually sold off for a different type of money. Think of it like 20 nickels, and Jesus is sold for like 20 dimes because the price is increased 2,000 years later. But it's this exact price. So it seems like this is a legitimate story that somebody knew about that was kept in their records. So Joseph is sold into slavery. Then we'll go back. In chapter 38, you have this weird story with Judah. And we'll end with this. We won't get to Joseph tonight. But we'll finish Joseph next week. We're almost out of But Judah is older at this point, and he has several sons. And his oldest son is married to this girl named Tamar, Canaanite girl. And Judah and his oldest son dies. Now, they have this thing in the ancient world. It's in the Jewish law, but it's also in kind of a custom that they put in called levirate marriage. And essentially it was, they don't have welfare or life insurance or anything like that in the ancient world. So essentially, if you had a brother and he died, if you weren't married, you were supposed to marry his widow to take care of her. So, maybe before they got married, you met the brother and go, okay, if he dies, is this somebody I want to marry or something like that? But this slide is actually not in the notes. I forgot about it and added it right like 10 minutes before we started. But so he gets married. So she marries his second son, and then he dies. So at this point, Judah's probably like, this lady's a black widow. She's either killing him or she's cursed or something. This is not good. So he's got a third kid. And she's supposed to marry the third kid to her, but he's like, I'm not marrying this kid. She keeps killing all my sons or something. So she goes, but he also won't release her from the marriage. So she can't go outside the family and get married. She has to marry within the family, but he also won't give her a third kid. So she's kind of trapped in this story because he won't let her marry, and so she comes up with this elaborate plan. She gets on the side of the road and dresses up like a prostitute, a cultic prostitute. And Judah comes walking by and sleeps with her. Not a great story, like I said. He's sleeping with his daughter-in-law, although he doesn't know that it's his daughter-in-law at this time. I'm assuming she got some kind of veil or something. But he doesn't have any money at the time. So she goes, well, why don't you just break off a piece of your staff and give it to me, and then when I'll come back later and show you that it was me, and you'll pay for it. And he goes, oh yeah, that sounds like a good plan. And she gets pregnant with his kid, which is just kind of weird and gross when you think about it, because it's her father-in-law. But so they find out eventually, they come talk to Judah and they go, hey, your daughter-in-law is pregnant. And you haven't given her anybody to marry, so she must have been kind of fooling around. So he brings her up and goes, hey, you been sleeping around with somebody? What's going on? And she goes, oh yeah, I saw his walking stick, and it had some type of engraving that showed that it was his. And so he's like completely embarrassed in the story. He looks terrible in this story. And so it shows kind of his lack of leadership. He's not ready to be the leader. Now eventually we'll see later on in the story he becomes a lot better. He kind of turns back to God. But it also shows kind of Canaan is not a very good place to raise a family. It'd be like raising a family in Las Vegas or something like that. So God is kind of laying the groundwork for, if this family's ever going to get turned to be and be a good family, I got to get him out of Canaan. It's not a good place to go. So that's where we get to then down to Joseph, who's going to be in Egypt, and he's eventually going to get the whole family down to Egypt. But we'll stop there because we're already over time. I got too caught up into all the little details and everything. See, I told you, every bullet point is a story, so you guys thought I was kidding. But we'll finish Joseph up next week, and then we will be done with Genesis and move on to Exodus. And instead of teaching Exodus, maybe I'll just show the Ten Commandments or something. But all right, well, let's close in prayer. God, we thank you for this day. God, we thank you for your perseverance, and we see in the Old Testament, even in the stories of Genesis, that even godly saints make mistakes and have issues and family troubles and all kinds of things. God, we thank you that you give us grace and patience, that when we make mistakes and have problems and have issues, that you're always there to help us work through them, to forgive us when we fail, and to be our God in the good times and in the bad times, God. Thank you for that. Pray that as we continue and wrap up Genesis next week, that we'll be able to just continue to see how your storyline has progressed. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.